So my lecture will be about Georgian attitudes to Russia. It will not be on Georgian-Russian relations, not on interstate relations, international relations between Georgia and Russia. That would be, in a way, easier subject for me. Maybe I decided for this school to challenge myself more. And I was, while I did choose this subject, I was not quite sure where to start, because that issue, Georgian attitudes to Russia, is quite complex, multidimensional, and frankly, I will talk about Russia all the time, almost obsessively in Georgia. We don't have done much of kind of reflection. Theoretical, more or less dispassionate theoretical reflection on what is our attitude to Russia. So why we have that attitude that we do. And so, of course, I cannot fully ignore the issue of Georgian-Russian relations and how bad they are. But although they are bad and complicated enough, I would not say that Georgian attitudes to Russia, it will not be my assumption that Georgia's attitudes to Russia are the result of bad interstate relations with Russia and conflicts with Russia, which I guess being listeners of this school more or less know, like territorial issues and things like that. But I think that the conflicts are also rooted in more deep-seated kind of attitudes that Georgians and Russians have to each other, or maybe arguably some kind of internal contradiction within Georgia and Russia, or in the way that Georgians and Russians have rebuilt their identities in post-communist, post-Soviet period. Now, I also mentioned Russia, that it's a complicated issue from Russian position, from Russian perspective, but I'm not going to speak about that. Georgian case is difficult enough. I would just say that Georgia's attitudes to Russia are rather multidimensional and often contradictory. And this does not only mean that different parts of the Georgian society have different opinions of Russia, different attitudes towards Russia, but which is true, of course, but also that if we come to individual persons or groups, maybe their attitudes towards Russia may be also complex and contradictory in themselves. As I said, this cannot be this issue fully explained by the fact that for whatever reasons we have these territorial issues with Russia, but we may think otherwise, or build kind of logical inferences otherwise, that maybe we have territorial issues with Russia, or that these territorial issues became so intractable because our more general attitudes and our more general kind of ways in which Georgia and Russia see their place in the new post-Soviet realm, post-Soviet reality, the post-Cold War, post-Cold War world, that actually exacerbated, at least, if not exacerbated, those specifically political and geopolitical issues. So I guess that these identity issues, both on Russian and Georgian side, are at the core of interstate conflicts rather than other way around, rather than interstate conflicts somehow induced Georgians to have those attitudes to Russia that we do. Of course, it's mutual relations, and both issues somehow reinforce each other, and the fact that Russia is kind of occupying Georgian territory, etc., it affects very strongly Georgia's attitudes to Russia, but maybe also Russia is occupying 20% of the Georgian territory because Georgian society has had those attitudes that it had for quite a long time. And now, how, as I said, I was not sure where to start. So I decided to start maybe some kind of official and predominant discourse and about Russia, I mean. And this discourse is apparently also shared by most of Georgia's society. When I say share, it is predominant, it's or hegemonic discourse, whatever. There are different terms, of course, used. It can be measured by facts. It's that first, almost all political parties, at least formally, stick to it in their public pronouncements. That mainstream media, discussions in the mainstream media, and large part of discussions in social media take this discourse for granted, and also public opinion polls show that this view of Russia is predominant. So, according to this discourse, Russia is not just a former imperial master, so it's not just post-colonial, as it were, but it's a present enemy and a source of threat. The most obvious issue, of course, is that Russia occupies 20% of its territory, comprising territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia or Skin Valley region. And so those territories were detached from Georgia as a result of Russia's military intervention, most recently in 2008. But it is not the only issue. We can imagine that Georgian territory is reduced by 20% as compared to its internationally recognized borders, and Georgia somehow accepts this reality. I mean, of course, Georgia does not reconcile itself to this reality. It's total taboo in Georgia to say that we have lost wars, but nations have lost wars. Maybe we should just cut our losses and continue to develop and build our lives on the remaining territory. But that's totally unacceptable even to mention in Georgia. So, Georgia does exist effectively, de facto, let's say so, in 80% of its internationally recognized territory. And but even that Georgia, if we put territorial issues aside, cannot make real peace with Russia because it is Georgia's official position that it aspires to European and Euro-Atlantic integration, that Georgia wants to be part of European Union and NATO. I mean, how realistic this Georgian aspiration is beyond the point here. I'm not going to discuss this, but it's certainly kind of the central point of Georgian policies. Kind of all Georgian policies have revolved around this aspiration for about 20 years at least. So And this is unacceptable to Russia. Russia considers this kind of perspective. I mean, Russia may be a little bit cool now that this perspective is not realistic anyway, but if it considers it's realistic, as much as it considers it's realistic, it's totally unacceptable to Russia. It's kind of Western infringement on its de facto kind of sphere of interest. And so, at least as Georgians see it, Russia would not accept genuinely sovereign Georgia, sovereignty implying also the choice of international friends like NATO and European Union, and it should be maybe, it would accept kind of formally independent Georgia, but Georgia, it would be generally kind of coordinated policies with Russia. And that's at least how Georgians see Russia. And and that's also a fundamental conflict. So there is one way in which Georgia sees its future, and this way is totally unacceptable to Russia, and Russia presumably does its best to prevent Georgia from being successful on its chosen path. And arguably this level of Georgia-Russian conflict is more fundamental and more intractable, and that's what I meant when I said that it's not the territorial issue defines the conflict between Georgia and Russia mainly, and everything follows from that, but it may be other way around. There is more fundamental conflict between Georgia and Russia, which implies, let's say so, genuine sovereignty of Georgia in choosing its path of development. And Georgia, one may say that Russia has punished Georgia for choosing that path by, territorial occupation. So that's means that this official Georgian discourse is somehow locked in or hegemonic, not just official, but hegemonic Georgian discourse is locked into this kind of dichotomy, Russia versus the West. And that's a formative dichotomy. Our thinking have been revolving around that since the time of independence, and I would say since the time of national independence movement in late 1980s. And basically we are hardly capable of discussing any important issue outside of this binary framework. And this is not, as I said, just official government view or political elite view. Of course, historically, all discourses developed by the elite. But okay, if it is so, this discourse penetrated Georgian society quite deeply, at least as we can see from polls, if we believe polls, and there are numerous polls, of course, which all show the same picture. For instance, I saw the February 2021 poll of International Republican Institute, and 88% of respondents named Russia as the source of the greatest threat for Georgia. And it was, after Russia, it was Turkey and Azerbaijan 7% each. So it's very straightforward. So for Georgia, Russia is the enemy or the source of threat. We don't have other enemies or other threats, only Russia, basically. And other polls, so numerous polls, show that majorities in the area of 70–80% support European and Euro-Atlantic integration. So that's so in that sense, even if historically it was elite discourse, now one cannot only call it elite discourse. So, and especially if we look politically at this point, okay, there are grounds to say that the current Georgian government would actually like to be less pro-Western, and it's more inclined by instincts to appease Russia, but it's not allowed to follow that instincts because of public mood. Because if it does anything that would suggest that it's more openly kind of pro-Russian or appeasing of Russia, then it would get a strong public rebuttal. It would have to pay political price. So many critics of the Georgian government, basically current Georgian government, believe that Georgian government is not really pro-Western, but it plays being pro-Western because it's pushed by the public mood. So that's that, as I say, would be a predominant discourse typical for Georgia, but it is also true that in this discourse, if you go deeper into it, Russia is not considered as just an external threat. So we presume that there are Georgian attitudes to Russia imply attitudes towards some kind of foreign country. But one can ask a question, how foreign is Russia for Georgia still at this time? I think Georgian preoccupation or bordering on obsession, as I say, that we link every issue in Georgia to Russia somehow, suggests, I think, that somehow Georgia is still not an external issue for Georgia, but rather also an internal issue. Of course, it is an external issue. Of course, occupation is real and Russian influence on Georgia is real, etc. But it is also an internal issue, which may be somewhat counterintuitive, because Georgia has been an independent country for almost 30 years. So it's a long enough time. And we have new generation of people who never been to Russia. Many of them don't speak any Russian. And for them, they don't know much about Russia. More Georgians travel to Europe or elsewhere, and much less Georgians travel to Russia. Also, the trends are that these societal linkages or economic linkages to Russia are rather, declining than otherwise. So, for instance, remittances from Russia have been a very important part of Georgian economy. I mean, we have very huge foreign payments deficit, so we import much more than we export. So, and economists say that remittances is very important source of covering that deficit. And Russian government often mentions this in their public discourse, that Georgia is so dependent on Russia still because we get so much remittances. But if we look at the trends, we see that during last decade especially, the share of Russian remittances has greatly declined as compared to previous times. So if even 10-15 years ago, Russian remittances, the numbers, that sum total of Russian remittances was greater than remittances from all other countries combined. Now, Russia is another source of remittances, but in some months we got more remittances from Italy, for instance, or some individual EU countries, even than from Russia. So even that that is declining. So, Russia has, if we look at the trends of these 30 years, less and less leverage on Georgia objective terms. However, despite this, despite having lived separately from Russia for about 30 years and having new generation, which is socialized in Georgia, which has not very many linkages with Russia, still we cannot really treat Russia as fully an external issue. Our internal problems that we have are often seen as somehow problems which are linked to Russia. So I would say there is external country, a foreign country called Russia, but there is also Russia within Georgia. At least Georgian discourse about Russia suggests that. There is this Russia within Georgia, which we want somehow to purge, or I mean we, meaning if we base ourselves on this, what I call hegemonic discourse of Georgia, kind of pro-Western Georgia that wants to be part of the West, was what stops us from becoming part of the West is not Russia's influence or not only just the Western reluctance to accept us, which is a huge problem, but it's a different kind of problem, but also there is this Russia within Georgia, which precludes that. And that Russia within Georgia, it may be considered something which in conventional terms is called reactionary or backward, or something linked to the Soviet past, something linked to Russian past in general. So it's this combination of mindsets and entrenched practices that come from the Soviet times. And that somehow stops us from becoming really part of the West. And there is no necessity, of course, in every country there is fight between more progressivist forces and more traditionalist forces. So we could, it's possible to conceptualize these kinds of fights this way, kind of culture wars. There are culture wars everywhere. Now especially it's very popular to speak about them, and we also have them. And we are in the middle of escalation of our culture wars, as you may know also from international media, unfortunately. But our trend is, our way is to conceptualize these wars, these internal developments as kind of fight of the West and Russia within Georgia. So in that sense, we might say that we consider Russia as kind of an internal Russia, whatever it means, like of a cancer in our bodies that we keep fighting. But here I should also say, which is always important to say when it comes to Georgian attitudes to Russia, that these terms, which are very strong terms that are used, purged or cancer, this suggests very strong anti-Russian feelings or Russophobia, if you wish to use that term, that word. But paradoxically, for many people, this Russophobia has never translated into some kind of cultural Russophobia or ethnic Russophobia. So we did not have anti-Russian xenophobia, which is Russophobia, right? In Georgia, in cultural or ethnic terms, there had never been aggressiveness, aggressive behavior, or even kind of hostile behavior towards Russians as such. And even in Soviet times, for instance, I remember I'm old enough to remember these things, that many people would say that there was this ethnic hostility towards Russians, for instance, in Baltic states, or maybe in Western Ukraine, but never in Georgia. And so this very strong political and ideological Russophobia contrasts with absence, basically, I would say near absence of cultural and ethnic Russophobia. This does not mean that Georgians are less inclined to be xenophobic than any other people. We are quite xenophobic towards some other people. And we note, especially in the last year, xenophobia, rise of the Georgian xenophobia towards, Turks or Iranians or some other people, or them have been, I think, not have been, but there is also kind of what we call Armenophobia sometimes in Georgia, because Armenians were dominant in Georgian business in 19th century, whatever. So we have our own ethnic, tensions inherent, or likes or dislikes. So Georgians are like anybody else in that sense. But paradoxically, that xenophobia was never targeting Russians. So anti-Russian, when we speak that anti-Russian attitudes are strong in Georgia on the one hand, but on the other hand, they are not, if we mean imply anti-Russian as something ethnic or cultural. Yes, so, and as I said, this is what I was talking about so far, is this predominant hegemonic narrative which is there in Georgia, which is sort of pro-Western, anti-Russian, this simple binary dichotomy. But there is also counter-narrative, which has become much more distinct in the last years, last 10 years approximately. Maybe we have a much stronger counter-narrative, and this is not only narrative, sometimes it becomes quite physical, as we saw, unfortunately, a couple of days ago in Tbilisi. And this counter-narrative is not about Russia directly, but it's linked to Russia. It's linked to Russia in both ways, which I mentioned today in this lecture. It is linked to Russia, or it's believed to link to Russia as an external actor to another country, to Kremlin, to Putin's Russia, whatever, which means that many people believe that this counter narrative is kind of fed from Russia or supported from Russia in different ways, but it is linked to Russia in other things, that this narrative somehow clicks with Russian propaganda narrative. But what is this counter narrative? If the dominant narrative is pro-Western, then counter narrative is anti-Western. It looks very simple and is very simple. I mean, the framework is simple. Complexities are start around this framework. What are the main components of this narrative, which is expressed in different ways? First, it's that it's aggressively anti-liberal narrative. The West is equated with liberalism or liberal values, and the liberal values are spread by the West. On the other hand, liberal values don't exist, are not seen independently of Western influence. And these liberal values spread by the West are false in themselves and pernicious for Georgia. So that's kind of the main assumption. They are pernicious for Georgia because they undermine traditional Georgian culture, institutions, and morality. And of course, there are different values, different liberal values, but it so happened and was confirmed 2 days ago that defense of sexual minorities, LGBTQ rights, has become kind of focal point of this fight. That LGBTQ rights is expression of how pernicious, immoral the West is, and how contrary it is to Georgian mentality, traditions, etc. So, and the West basically imposes upon us is this immorality. That's kind of the most this clear-cut, but also maybe most effective message of this counter narrative. Then there, of course, it is also, if I spoke about Russia within Georgia, which we have to purge, which is kind of cancelled. This counter narrative is a mirror image of the hegemonic narrative that we have the West within, that Trojan horse, cancer, which consists of Georgia's liberal elites, NGOs, dependent on Western funding, media, corrupt politicians, meaning being bought by the West, public intellectuals, etc. That's kind of general, traditional and internationally recognizable view of liberal elites. And these are enemies of their country. They sold their souls and maybe bodies to Western donors and work against the interest of their country. On the positive side, Eastern Orthodoxy is the core of the Georgian identity and culture, and Georgian Orthodox Church is the principal guardian of Georgianness. So real Georgian is an Orthodox Georgian. And so when external or internal liberal forces fight Georgia, their main target is the church. So they are keen to destroy religion and Orthodoxy. And this fighting, and so the church is the main ally. And on geopolitical level, the course towards integration into EU and NATO is counterproductive for the country. So it's wrong course. Why? Because it puts on collision course with Russia. So not all of representatives of these groups that express that counter narrative talk maybe about geopolitics, but many of them do, and usually all of them see EU and NATO as enemies, not only because, or some of them may downplay this issue at all, because they don't want to be accused of being openly pro-Russian, but typically still they are either cool about Georgia's Western integration or openly critical about it. So they are bad, not only because they are kind of imposing homosexuality and general immorality, but because they intentionally put us on collision course with Russia and use us as a kind of in their efforts to weaken Russia as a champion of orthodoxy and champion of anti-liberal movement. So, and it's popular to say that, yes, it's true that 20% of Russia is occupied by, 20% of Georgia is occupied by Russia, but 80% of Georgia is occupied by the United States. That's formula proposed by one of the intellectual leaders of this movement, Levan Basadze. So, so that's kind of my short summary of this counter narrative. And usually, save for this last geopolitical component, usually these people are not pro-Russian, or they are openly pro-Russian in their discourse, and they usually, and there are lots of research on these groups and interviews, etc., and they deny strongly that they are pro-Russian, but of course they don't deny that they are anti-Western. So then we enter here some ground of I don't know, not maybe conspiracy theories, but at least unproven assumptions. There are some groups that are openly friendly with Eurasian movement and Dugin and people like that. So there are some other groups that may not be openly friendly with them, but we may have a legitimate suspicions that they have some hidden ties with Russia and get some support, financial support from Russia by some through some undisclosed ways. But or some may be just they don't like Russia at all, but they hate the West even more. So that's I think it depends on. There are lots of different groups, etc. But what is undeniable, and so there is also no consensus about among scholars who study these groups on this issue. Some say that it's wrong to call them pro-Russian, but nobody denies that there is a very strong coincidence and overlap in messages, that Russian propaganda messages and again anti-Western, anti-liberal messages and messages of these groups mainly coincide in their main points, on their main converge on their main points, and this Russian narrative is often a source, obvious source of these Georgian messages. So to sum up, I would say I know there were some presentations in your summer school of post-coloniality or anti-coloniality, and this kind of terminology is now popular. So I would say that we have this clash of two narratives, pro-Western and pro-Russian, as we call them in Georgia, and both of these narratives are anti-colonial in their structure, and nationalists. Anti-colonialism is nationalism are basically the two sides of the same coin, but they are two very different kinds of coloniality or anti-coloniality or or nationalism. What I call hegemonic narrative is a species of progressive liberal nationalism, which is anti-colonial in that it is anti-Russian, which sees Russia as a threat to Georgia's sovereignty, but also to the Georgia's prospect of development. But it is countered by another kind of Georgian nationalism, which is anti-liberal nationalism, ethnic but also religious nationalism. In its ethnic nationalism, of course, but in its the public discourse, it highlights more religious identity, and it is anti-colonial because it targeted against the West. So it kind of emulates anti-colonial language, but in its application to the West. So the West is our new imperial master, which imposes, which is indirect imperialism, which imposes on us Western values and ways, and so we have to fight it. So we have this fight for kind of heart of Georgian identity. That is a fight between two definitions of Georgian identity, and these are both somehow expressed in general anti-colonial framework, but it is totally contrary to each other. And of course, it's important to also discuss the forces about this counter-narrative. As I said, I said that this pro-Western narrative is usually considered hegemonic. I consider it hegemonic in the sense that I said, that it is supported by most political parties. As I say, there is maybe suspicion that the ruling party, Georgian Dream, does not really support it as much as it claims, but okay, those are suspicions. Formally, it is all for European and Euro-Atlantic integration, and they say that we'll actually formally file some kind of application to European Union in 2024. So how more European you can be. And this is another is more kind of narrative of resistance. So it recognizes hegemonic character of pro-Western narrative, but it's a force of resistance, the counter narrative, this anti-liberal nativist narrative. And how strong is that? So again, if we look at numbers as far as they are available, it is not very strong. If we look at political parties who represent that narrative, these parties, no party ever got more than 5% in elections, no individual party, and there are other parties, but no other party got more than a couple of percentage points. So politically, they are not very strong. They have their own NGOs and media and different groups, but the membership of these groups is not terribly high. So when they mobilize, usually it's kind of several hundred people most of the time. Of course, they compensate for it by extremely aggressive behavior, but apparently the numbers are not too great. That's kind of optimistic interpretation, maybe, from this pro-Western, from a representative of more pro-Western point of view. But I think that optimistic interpretation would be quite untypical. Most Georgians of this kind of pro-Western persuasion are very deeply concerned about growth of this groups for different reasons. One, that even if what I describing is only a core of groups that are kind of dedicated to this issue, to this counter narrative, what I described as counter narrative, and make it their business to propagate it, to defend it, and sometimes to aggressively defend it in the streets. But around this core, there is some kind of more amorphous mass, let's say so, of empathizers, and that is very, very difficult to measure. Of course, the main strengths of this direction and this counter narrative is the church, which is again also divided in itself. The church, official narrative of the church, that we are for European integration also, but we just don't like certain things in the West, like this propaganda of homosexuality, as they call it. So But you know, if we can find some accommodation. But a large part of the church hierarchy and and probably majority of of clergy is much closer in their understanding and in their ideas to this counter narrative than to what I called kind of official or hegemonic narrative. And of course, the church has kind of strong sway over Georgian society. Its ratings, its support sort of declined in the last years. And I think this association with open aggression, like aggressive actions in this week, basically, beginning of this week, but also some other episodes, contributed to decline in popularity of the church, but it is still considered very powerful actor, and it is still considered the force behind this anti-liberal counter-narrative in Georgia. So that makes this movement potentially at least quite strong. And so there are quite a few people who generally question, for instance, these very high numbers of support for European and Euro-Atlantic integration, not in the sense that it's false or it's bad work of pollsters, not in that sense, but that this commitment is kind of skin deep and it's not translated to real commitment to European values or Western values or whatever you call it. So there is, even if at this point these forces are not terribly strong, they have potential to grow. But last but not least, their strength is very much augmented by the policies of the government and position of this government, of Georgian Dream government. And Georgian Dream government in itself is kind of a very amorphous group around this fabulously rich by Georgian standards. So you cannot compare it with Jeff Bezos, but by Georgian standard, Bidzina Ivanishvili is very rich and widely believed to be a real boss in Georgia, and this Georgian Dream Party is very amorphous kind of conglomerate of individuals, self-seeking individuals who just want to be close to power. It does not have anything like distinct ideology. So it does, I think many of people in this group are just, work for Bidzina Ivanishvili in one way or another, but not for some ideas. But some part of their support depends on this kind of on those circles, that part of society, broader part of society, which may not be a member of these different aggressive extreme right groups, but kind of empathize with them and likes them. And therefore we have seen consistently that the government at least is very relaxed and with regards to these groups. When they use violence or open threats of violence, they are very rarely punished for their violent behavior, as we saw 2 days ago. So maybe occasionally somebody is punished, but very, very weakly. And there is a strong suspicion, let's say so, well-grounded suspicion that while verbally kind of government says that, oh, we are against violence, but in reality, they consider these groups as an ally, because these groups hate the West, as I said, but they hate internal West in Georgia even more, and this represented by opposition parties, so-called pro-Western opposition parties, which is almost all of the opposition, and media and civil society, which is also main opponent of the government. So basically, government and the government, Georgian Dream, and these anti-liberal nativist groups, they have the same enemy, and they have also the same friend in the Georgian church. So there is this kind of convergence or collusion, arguably, between the government and these groups, which of course makes them much more powerful. And I think if we talk about also these latest events, partly, of course, it is maybe natural culture war in Georgia, and societal development is always accompanied by this kind of culture wars. But there is also political explanation that these groups would not dare to do what they did without feeling that not only church, but also quite influential groups in Georgian government, at least, if not Zina Ivanishvili personally, are on their side, and they should not be afraid too much of any punishment for what they did.